Welcome everyone to part 3 of episode 4, where we're talking about the structure of the Indian military. We've already covered the Indian Army, we've covered the Indian Air Force, and Sohraab, let's talk about the Indian Navy now.
Sure.
So let's dive right into it, literally and figuratively. So can you tell us about the structure of the Indian Navy first up?
So the structure, the way that the Indian Navy is structured is that, like the Air Force and the Army, it has branches. So it has various branches, like just like the Air Force, it has accounts, and then it has law, as well as, of course, the aviation branch. And then the thing is that the Indian Navy is the branches are much more apparent. So even the ranks of the other of the ORs in the Indian Navy, they'll have the symbol of their respective role.
Okay.
So if you ever have the chance to go on a vessel of the Indian Navy, all the ORs you'll see, they'll have a certain symbol. So it might be a lightning bolt, or a cogwheel, or anchors. So that denotes their branch. So like there's also the technicians, the flight technicians.
So a little bit of differentiation in the way that
There is a lot of branches in the Indian Navy. We don't even have enough time to cover them.
I understand. So let's talk about the ships that we have. Of course, that is also the more interesting part of the Indian Navy, and there's a lot of new additions also that we've been reading in the news recently. So let's shed some light on the different ships that we have as a part of the Navy.
So there has been a lot of conversation post World War II on how ships are to be classed, since warships are divided into certain classes depending on the size and role.
Okay.
So a lot of classes have been discarded for because they've either become obsolete or another class has taken their position, so that classification doesn't have to exist anymore. So an example of a type of ship that has fallen to obsolescence is the battleship, which used to be really a huge symbol of a nation's navy in earlier times. So the battleship used to have huge cannons, and it was designed for large battles at sea, at high sea. Those don't really exist anymore because doctrinally speaking, they aren't really relevant. But there are certain interesting examples. So, for example, the U.S. Navy actually used battleships during the invasion of Iraq. So that's it was very interesting, and it's become a really significant part of the niche of military conversations on the internet. So although battleships don't exist anymore, there's still a huge symbol of naval prowess and the naval conversations regarding the Navy.
Correct.
So that's an example of a class that doesn't exist anymore. Another would be the cruiser. That doesn't exist anymore. So the main class that we have is, starting from the largest, would be the aircraft carrier. Of course, very significant, been in conversation for a long time now. Our latest, the Vikrant, which has been built indigenously, also known as the IAC. So these, of course, are built to carry aircraft and to deploy them at sea, which is a very interesting concept. So the aircraft carrier sort of acts as a mothership or a queen bee for all of its other drones. So that's the aircraft carrier, and it has a huge complement depending on the size. So the US Navy, for example, has 11 aircraft carriers. We only have 2 as of now. So the aircraft carriers now has, in a sense, replaced the battleship in the significance that they hold.
That's true.
So so the main role of the aircraft carrier is to deploy aircraft, and that's a huge tool of power projection in the modern age for navies and nations in general across the world. So if you have an aircraft carrier, you can know that your navy is lean and mean And of course, the subgroups of aircraft carriers.
Right.
Certain aircraft carriers may be able to carry larger aircraft like AWACS, like we mentioned in the previous part of the
Correct.
Indian Air Force. And some may only be able to carry fighters. Then some are even able to carry helicopters. So helicopter carriers.
Yeah.
Those are aircraft carriers. Then we have destroyers, which are relatively faster, and they fulfill a bunch of different roles, including most glaringly the anti-submarine warfare role. So those are the destroyers. These destroyers are also meant to escort, say, convoys that are carrying cargo or other aircraft carriers, since aircraft carriers are usually organized into carrier strike groups. So aircraft carriers have all these different ships that have sort of formed an ecosystem around the carrier. So that's usually how carriers operate along with destroyers. Then the corvettes that are usually also made for anti-submarine warfare. The fast attack craft, which are smaller, they're made for littoral combat, that are made for low seas, that are made for coastal combat. Iran has deployed many of these. Since they're cheap to make, they're lethal against even bigger ships because they still carry a lot of armament, but they're smaller, they're faster. Same with patrol craft. So a lot of naval warfare conversation these days is focusing around smaller craft that are small, are agile, but still pack a punch, are still lethal. So that's a brief overview of the types of vessels. There are also the frigates.
Yeah, of course.
So this is a brief overview of the type of vessels that navies across the world operate. But these definitions of classes are constantly changing. So that's why we haven't gone in depth too much. But those are the main classes that are still in use, that have been used over time.
Right. And how are these ships classified or structured within the Indian Navy?
So basically, these ships are designated into surface ships as well as submarines. So surface ships are usually considered separate from the submarines. So those are the two main classifications. And then, of course, they're organized into units. Squadrons exist in the Indian Navy as well. Then there are flotillas. And that's what sets the Indian Navy apart from the Indian Air Force and the Indian Army. That these units are constantly changing, sizes are constantly changing. But yes, and of course another example of a unit is the carrier strike group. So largely these units are organized into the Western and Eastern Fleet. So the Western Fleet has, of course, jurisdiction over the western half of the Indian Ocean as well as the Arabian Sea. Then the Eastern Fleet has jurisdiction eastwards over the South China Sea, which is of increasing geopolitical relevance, the Bay of Bengal, as well as the eastern half, eastern part of the Indian Ocean. So, and then these fleets respectively come under the command of the Western Naval Command and the Eastern Naval Command. Then there's the Southern Naval Command, which is mainly for training. So that's how these commands are organized.
So you just spoke about the increasing relevance or importance of maritime security. So we also see the Indian Navy not only, I mean, of course, the South China Sea is important. We have pressure coming in from, and the geopolitical nature of the entire, of different countries is changing rather, right? And we also saw recently that the Indian Navy was involved in the Red Sea as well, where the pirates had attacked. The raids happened. So can you shed some more light about this increasing or the change rather in maritime security that's happening?
Yeah, definitely. So the thing is that over time, like I mentioned before, these smaller watercrafts are becoming much more relevant. So, for example, like I mentioned, Iran. In order to counter Iran's smaller craft, the US Navy has invested in what's called the Littoral Combat Ship, or the LCS. and our Indian Navy has come up with many different implements in order to fight piracy. And in fact, this is one of the examples of global cooperation where even the North Koreans have pitched in order to fight piracy. And this is one of the examples of global cooperation. So raiding, so Somali pirates have become quite a significant threat to civilian merchant navies. So, for example, the Indian Navy have their own special forces infantry called the Marine Commandos or the Marcos. So these have been employed quite extensively in recent years to fight these pirates.
Right.
And of course, then there's the South China Sea, which is why the Andaman and Nicobar Command has been propped up as a combined arms, as a joint command, in order to coordinate tri-service efforts to combat the increasing influence of the Chinese Navy, or well, the PLAN as they call themselves.
That's wonderful, Sohraab. I think a very good explanation of what's been happening, and I think it's evident that there are a lot of changes that we'll be seeing, especially in terms of maritime security and the way things play out in the future. So thank you again for this wonderful episode and insightful, and hope to see you again in the next one. Thank you.